Welcome back to No Limit Hold'em 1001. Today we're going to be talking about monotone flops. So the learning outcomes for today, we're going to be talking about common attacking strategies for the button and defensive strategies and counter-attacking strategies for the big blind for monotone flops in single raise pots between the big blind and the button. So what is a monotone flop? So a monotone flop is a flop where all of the three cards are of the same suit. And so flushes are immediately possible. So we can either have a monotone flop that is connected or it can be disconnected. And connected monotone flops have possible straight flushes. Monotone flops occur roughly 5.2% of the time, independent of the whole cards of both players. And many players misplay monotone flops because they misjudge how strong their hand is relative to other hands. Blockers are quite important in monotone flops, especially blockers to flushes. For example, a blocker to a strong flush will remove all the flushes of that rank from the opponent's range. Say for example, the monotone flop is Jack high, all of spades, and we have the ace of spades. This means that our opponent cannot have a flush using the ace of spades. In other words, they can't have the nut flush. And many of these blocker hands also have good draw equity. Moving on to our c-bet strategy. On monotone flops, we'll often use a small to medium bet size, from the smallest bet possible, one big blind, to around half the pot. And against our bet, the big blind will have a lot of offsuit hands in their range, and many of these offsuit hands will have a flush draw accompanying it that can call. In general, if the rank of the board cards is low or the board is connected, we're going to continuation bet more frequently than if the rank of the cards is high or the board is disconnected. So here the button opens to two big blinds and the big blind calls, and the flop is ace of spades, nine of spades, six of spades. Our strategy from the button for our continuation bet, we choose to bet a little over 45% of the time. Compared to this example, jack of spades, six of spades, four of spades, we choose to continuation bet a little over 70% of the time. And so we can see the difference in the rank of the board cards and our continuation bet strategy from the button. Now when choosing which hands to continuation bet, our flushes are bet at quite a high frequency, especially the stronger flushes. Additionally, sets are often bet a lot of the time. And weaker sets are bet more frequently than stronger sets, because the weaker sets are less likely to block strong pairs in our opponent's hand that might call. Here when we look at the flushes from example 1.2, we can see that the flushes are bet a large majority of the time. We have 32 combinations of flushes and we bet over 27 combinations of those flushes, which means that we're betting more than 80% of the time on average when we have a flush. And we can also see that the stronger flushes are bet slightly more often than the weaker flushes. The sets are also bet at a very high frequency. We have 9 combinations of sets in our range, and we're betting over 8.5 combinations of this 9. Our overpairs are often bet as well, especially if they have a flush draw, and the weaker overpairs are bet more often than the stronger overpairs. On the other hand, top pair hands are bet more often without the flush draw, and the stronger top pairs are bet more often than the weaker top pairs. So here we can see our strategy with our overpairs. Ace-ace with the ace of spades is bet far more often than ace-ace without the ace of spades. And we can also see that queen-queen is bet a very large proportion of the time with or without the flush draw. Moving on to our top pair hands, we can see that our stronger top pairs are bet a little bit more often than our weaker top pairs. And the top pair hands with a flush draw, such as ace of spades, jack, is bet a little bit less often than the top pairs without the flush draw, such as ace jack without the ace of spades. For our bluffs, flush draws without much showdown value are bet quite frequently, especially the nut flush draw and second nut flush draws. Additionally, the stronger ace high hands with a weak flush draw are quite likely to check back, and air hands with overcards are often bet. In other words, a hand without a pair and without a strong draw with naked overcards are bet quite frequently. Here we look at our strategy with the nut flush draw. We can see that our nut flush draws with less showdown value, such as ace of spades 3 and ace of spades 2, are bet slightly more often than the nut flush draw with more showdown value, such as ace of spades 6 or ace of spades king. Here we see some of our weaker flush draws. We can see that an ace high with a weak flush draw, such as ace 10 with the 10 of spades, is quite often checked back. Here we can see more of our air hands, and a hand like king queen with just naked overcards is bet at a very high frequency. Here we're moving on to facing a c-bet when we're the big blind. Now remember, as a big blind we have many offsuit hands that the button does not, and so we can defend against the button's c-bet by calling with the flush draws from his offsuit hands. And the amount of our range that we will defend depends on the size of the c-bet that the button chooses to use. Even if we face a very small bet size, we will often fold many of our hands without a flush draw. And this includes many of our ace high hands as well as underpairs and weaker gut shots. However, against this c-bet size, all of our flush draws can continue. So here in this example, the button opens and the big blind calls. The flop is queen of spades, jack of spades, 7 of spades, and the button bets 1/4 of the pot. We can see against this quarter pot bet size, we're folding almost a third of our range. When we're looking at our ace high hands, we can see that many of our ace highs will fold to this very small bet. And we can also see that the distinction between which hands we choose to call and which hands we choose to fold have to do with whether or not we have a flush draw. Additionally, if we're looking at our weaker pairs, we can see that the under pairs to the board are folded if they do not have a flush draw and called if they do have a flush draw. Against larger bet sizes from the button, we should fold more of our range. We can fold the majority of our ace high without a flush draw, as well as more of our weak pairs without a flush draw. And against some of the bigger sizes, we will start to fold some of our weaker flush draws. So this example is the same flop from before, except now instead of the button betting quarter of the pot, the button decides to bet half of the pot. Here we can see our strategy from the big blind. We can see that we're folding a little over 45% of the time. Here we can see that some of those folds come from our weaker pairs. Even bottom pair, like 10-7, is folded some of the time without a spade. Additionally, some of our weaker flush draws will fold. Here we see that ace 5 is folded some of the time with the 5 of spades, but never folded with the ace of spades. But ace 4 with the 4 of spades is always folded. When we decide to check raise, we'll use a mixture of flushes and sets for value, especially some of our very stronger flushes that don't block the button's middling flushes. For bluffs, we'll often raise flush draws that are quite strong but don't have much showdown value. Here we can see the strategy for our flushes. We're more likely to raise the nut flush or second nut flush like ace-3 or king-2 because the 3 and the 2 don't block as many middling flushes from the button's range. So ace-3 does not block a flush like 10-6. Here we can see our nut flush draws are sometimes raised as a bluff, especially the nut flush draws that we have without much showdown value. So we can see that ace-6 with the ace of spades is raised some of the time, but a hand like ace-10 with the ace of spades is always called. Now moving back to the button, when we're facing a check raise, we'll continue with the majority of our range as a call. But against smaller raise sizes, we'll have a larger flop 3-bet range. And even against very small raises, we will still fold almost all of our air. So here in this example, we're the button and we open to 2 big blinds and the big blind calls. The flop is 10 of spades, 5 of spades, 4 of spades. The big blind checks, we choose to continuation bet half the pot, and then the big blind clicks it back to 4.5 big blinds. And we're faced with the decision of what to do. So here we can see that even against this small raise, this min raise from the big blind, we're folding a lot of our naked air hands. And we can see here that ace-queen without a spade is folded the majority of the time. So against a raise, we'll choose to fold most of our air and continue with many of our draws and made hands. Against larger check raise sizes, we'll start to fold more of our range, and this includes weaker flush draws as well as some of our weaker pairs. So this example is the same as the previous example, except instead of us facing a min raise by the big blind, we're facing a raise of half pot. We can see against this larger size, we're folding quite a bit more of our range. We start to fold with some of our weaker pairs, such as some of our 5x and 4x hands. And we're also folding some of our weaker flush draws. We can see that Jack-9 with 1 spade is sometimes folded. The strategy that we will use for our turn probes as the big blind will depend on what the specific turn card is. Many bet sizes can be used, but medium bet sizes between 50% and 100% of the pot are quite common. The aim with our turn probe strategy will be to get some value with our strong hands without leaving our checking range vulnerable to overbets. Our flushes will often be bet, but many of the flushes are checked with the intention of calling or raising the delayed c-bet. And the same is also true for sets and 2-pair hands, with the weaker sets and 2 pairs being slightly more likely to be bet. So in this example, the button opens and we call from the big blind, and the flop is Jack of spades, 9 of spades, 2 of spades, and the flop goes check check, and then the turn is the 5 of hearts. Here we can see our turn probe strategy. We're betting the turn almost 25% of the time. Here if we look at our flushes, we can see that of the 33.7 combinations of flushes that we have, we're betting about 17 of those combinations. So on average, if we have a flush, we're going to be betting it around half the time. And then the remainder of our flushes will be checked with the intention of either raising the delayed c-bet or calling the delayed c-bet, and then using those flushes in our river strategy. Moving on to a delayed c-bet strategy as the button. Once again, it will depend on the specific turn card, but similar to the flop c-bet strategy, our delayed c-bet strategy was going to be using a small to medium bet size. We're going to be betting most of our remaining strong hands, such as flushes and sets, the majority of the time, and many of our top pair and overpair hands will bet the turn as well as betting the river. We can also bet some middle pairs to get value from our opponent's draws and weaker pairs with the intention of checking back most rivers. Here this is the same example as before, except now we're the button. The flop goes check check and the big blind checks the turn. So we can have a look at our strategy for our delayed c-bet. Here we can see a delayed c-bet on this specific turn card is that we're betting almost half of the time. Now as a big blind, if we are facing a delayed c-bet, our strategy will change depending on what the turn card is and the size of the bet that we're facing. In general, we're going to be continuing with many of our made hands and our stronger draws, but the weaker flush and straight draws can be folded, as well as even some of our weakest pairs. When we choose to raise, we're going to be raising some of our flushes and sets for value, and even against small to medium bet sizes, a strong top pair with a flush draw can be used to raise for value. For bluffs, we'll be using some flush draws with a low showdown value. In this example, we have the same flop as before, the same turn as before. We're in the big blind, we check, the button bets half the pot, and then it's on us. This is our strategy facing the delayed c-bet. We can see that we're folding a little over 45% of the time. Here we're having a look at our flushes. Of our 16.7 combinations of flushes, we're going to be raising around 8.4 combinations. So our flushes, when we're facing this specific delayed c-bet size, is going to raise around half the time. Similarly, any remaining sets that we have will be raised quite often. Against the half pot delayed c-bet, some of our top pair hands with a flush draw are strong enough to raise for value. Here, our strategy with King Jack is that if we have King Jack with the King of Spades, we're going to be raising it quite often, but if we don't have the King of Spades, we're going to be raising it relatively rarely. Our bluffs with the nut flush draw will be focused around hands which have relatively low showdown value. For example, Ace of Spades 3 is raised all the time, but Ace of Spades Queen is almost always called. Moving on to double barreling as the button. So we've continuation bet the flop, and the big blind has called, and now we see the turn card. The big blind checks, and it's on us. If the turn is an overcard, we're going to be c-betting with a wider range for a medium bet size. And many of our new top pair hands will be able to bet for value against weaker pairs. And similarly, hands stronger than top pair will be bet the majority of the time. In this example, we're the button, we open 2 big blinds, and the big blind calls, and the flop is 10 of spades, 5 of spades, 4 of spades. Big blind checks, we see about half pot, the big blind calls, the turn is the King of Hearts, and the big blind checks. Now we're going to have to make a decision on our turn double barrel strategy. With the overcard King, our turn continuation bet strategy will be using a medium bet size with a slightly less polar range. Here we're betting half the pot with almost 55% of our hands. We can see that most of our new top pairs are being bet for value. When deciding on our turn c-bet strategy, many of our flush draws will continue to bet on the turn if they've bet on the flop. And this is especially true for flush draws without much showdown value. The weaker pairs that we bet on the flop can check back the turn and hope to reach showdown. And air hands will be bluffed more often if they have pair draws from high cards. So they use their pair draw equity to increase the strength of their bluff. The majority of our nut flush draws are going to continue to bet. Some are checked, especially if they have some sort of showdown value. The majority of our weak pairs are going to be checked back on the turn, hoping to either improve on the river or reach showdown. Our unmade hands are often bet if they have an overcard to the top pair on the flop. So we can see here that Jack 8 offsuit is going to be bet a little over half of the time. The Jack gives 3 outs to beat a 10x hand in the opponent's range, and the 8 gives an additional 3 outs to beat a pair weaker than 8s. If the turn is an undercard, we're going to be c-betting the turn less often and use a more polar range, and so our bet size is going to be larger on average. In this example, instead of the turn being the King of Hearts, the turn is the 9 of Hearts. We can see that on average we're using a slightly larger bet size. When the turn was the King of Hearts, we often used a half pot bet size with the majority of our betting range, but with the turn being the 9 of Hearts, we're using a full pot bet size with most of our bets. We're also betting slightly less often. Here we're only betting 49% of the time, compared to the 55% that we were betting if the turn was the King of Hearts. An interesting turn card for monotone flops is when the turn brings 4 to a flush. And if this happens after we've continuation bet the flop, then our turn c-bet strategy will become very polarized. In essence, we'll be using the nut flush for our value range, and so the bet sizes that we're going to be using on these turns will often be an overbet, such as a size between 100 and 200% of the pot, or sometimes even bigger. On the 4 to a flush turn, we're going to be continuation betting our sets at high frequency as a semi-bluff, looking to give up the river if unimproved, or if the river pairs the board, our sets will shove all in. We can also bluff some of our weaker straight draws, which have the ability to outdraw a set or 2 pair if our opponent decides to call these hands. Our weaker pairs will also sometimes be bluffed, because these hands block sets and can be used as a river bluff if the board pairs. Other unmade hands with very low equity can also be used to bluff. So here in this example, the flop is the same as before, with continuation bet the turn for half the pot, and now the turn is the Queen of Spades bringing 4 to a flush. Our turn continuation bet strategy is quite polar. Here you can see that we're betting a little over 20% of the time, but when we do bet, we're using a size of twice the pot. If we look at the type of nut flush hands that we choose to bet, we're going to be betting nut flush hands with only 1 spade. So for example, we would be betting Ace of Spades, Jack of Hearts, but we wouldn't be betting Ace of Spades, Jack of Spades. We're also less likely to bet nut flushes that block pairs on the board. So here we can see that Ace of Spades 9 is always being used as an overbet for value, but Ace of Spades 10 is not, because the 10 blocks 2 pair hands in the big blind's range that might call. If we have a look at our sets, we're going to be betting the vast majority of our sets as a semi-bluff. If we look at some of our weaker hands, we can see that we're betting a mixture of straight draws, some weaker pairs, and air with an overcard. Moving on now to triple barreling. Our triple barrel strategy will depend on what our turn c-bet strategy was, as well as what the river card is. In general, on safe turns and rivers, all of our remaining flushes can be bet for a very large size, often all in. And strong hands like sets, straights, and strong 2 pairs can be bet for a medium bet size. Our bluffs will come from the bottom of our range, and we have to pay close attention to which hands that we block. If we decide to bluff an ace high, we'll prefer to use an ace high without the nut flush blocker, and instead choose to use blockers to other flushes. In this example, we're at the button. We open the 2 big blinds, and the big blind calls. The flop is 10 of spades, 5 of spades, 4 of spades, we continuation bet half the pot. The turn is the 9 of hearts. We continuation bet full pot, and then the river is the king of hearts. The big blind checks, and it's on us to decide what to do. This is our triple barrel strategy for this run out. We can see that we're betting around half the time. 15% of the time, we're going to be shoving all in for a little over 3 times the pot. And around 32% of the time, we're going to be betting full pot. We have 12.2 combinations of flushes, and we bet all in with 6.5 combinations of these flushes. And with our remaining flushes, we're going to be betting full pot. And so this means that if we get to the river in this way, roughly half of our flushes will shove all in, and the remainder of our flushes will be used in the other bet size. All of our sets are bet for the 100% pot bet size. When we're deciding on which bluffs to use, our ace highs with the nut flush blocker are almost always checked. However, ace highs with blockers to other flushes can be used to shove all in as a bluff. Here we see that ace of spades jack is checked back, but ace with the jack of spades is always shoved all in for 3 times the pot as a bluff. In summary, around 5.2% of all flops are monotone, and the cause of most errors in people's play on monotone flops is due to wrongly assessing how strong their hand is relative to other hands. And knowing about how blockers work is very important when thinking about monotone flops. As the button, our c-bet size will vary from a min bet to around half the pot. And on turns and rivers, our continuation bet sizes for double and triple barrels can be larger. On certain turns, overbets can be used, and on rivers, flushes can be shoved all in. On monotone flops, when the rank of the cards on the board is low, or the board is connected, we're going to be continuation betting more frequently. And our flushes and sets are bet quite often. When we have a pocket pair, if we have a flush draw with our pocket pair, we're going to be more likely to bet than if we didn't have a flush draw. On the other hand, if we're deciding to bet a top pair, we are more likely to bet top pairs without flush draws. When we're double barreling, we need to pay attention to what the turn card is. On overcards, we're going to be betting many of the new top pairs, and on undercards, we're going to be using a slightly larger bet size and continuing with many of our hands stronger than top pair. However, if the turn brings 4 to a flush, our double barrel strategy will become far more polarized and will often use overbets. Our range will consist of the nut flush for value, as well as sets as a semi-bluff, and many weaker pairs and air hands from the bottom of our range will also be used to bluff. When we triple barrel, we'll often be using a very polarized range, and this often means that for our flushes, we can shove all in. And our other strong hands can be bet for a medium bet size such as 50% or 100% of the pot. And one thing to note is that the nut flush blocker is more often checked on the river than used as a bluff bet, where we have preference to shove all in if we block a flush that is not the nut flush. Moving over to the big blind. Against the c-bet or delayed c-bet, we should be making use of many of our offsuit hands with a flush draw to defend. And so this means that we're going to be folding many of our unmade hands without a flush draw, including many of our ace highs. When we defend, we're going to be continuing mainly as a call. And if we choose to raise the flop c-bet, our raising range will consist of our strongest flushes and as well as our sets for value. And against the delayed c-bet, our value range can widen to include hands such as top pair with a strong kicker and a flush draw. That's the end of this lecture. Thank you for listening.